Heather Marquette, she's the senior lecturer at the in the International Development Department at the University of Birmingham. She's published several articles on corruption and good governance, including a very good book on corruption in the World Bank. Not corruption in the World Bank, the role of a World Bank in combating corruption. That's the second blunder of the day. Before I say anything more, Heather, over to you.
Okay. Thanks, James. And first of all, I'll say I'm really welcome today's workshop. It's very well put together. I'm thankful to the invitation from Alina to take part. The workshop is particularly timely given that so much aid is being directed or redirected to fragile states, here in the UK and beyond. So it's definitely something that we should be looking at. However, it's also one of the most important challenges that the international community is faced with right now. I want to reflect on a couple of the underlying themes brought up in the previous speakers, but one of them is not going to be results, I have to say. The first is the need to be realistic. It's actually the absence of political and governance institutions that make a state fragile. So we shouldn't actually expect very much in terms of transparency and accountability in fragile states. It's precisely the absence of transparency and accountability that actually make states fragile. And James, you used the word messy, and that's a very apt term to use. So we're starting from a very low baseline, and expectations from the international community, from the public and donor countries and so on, need to be realistic about what's achievable from that particular baseline. I have to say, this is absolutely not a call to do nothing or to not be concerned about corruption in fragile states. Claire very clearly pointed out, and I love the graphic with the crossing paths there, that the risks of not dealing with accountability early on in the reconstruction phase are really dire in the medium to long term if it's not taken seriously. Certainly, at the very least, we should have high expectations from the international community, whether it's donors, whether it's companies working for public funding, whether it's just private companies who are operating under a Western flag or so on, that they will behave with integrity. We should certainly also expect that the international community will try its hardest not to make things more fragile on the ground and not to destabilize things further through policy or political interventions that actually might be destabilizing. After all, fighting corruption is inherently destabilizing. That's what it's all about. It's a fight, a battle, a war. I think Claire used the words that it's often come with a confrontational approach. Essentially, it's about taking power from one group of people and moving it to another. In an ideal world, it's going to be the public, but that's not often the case. It's usually about moving resources from one powerful group to another powerful group in reality. And there's plenty of empirical evidence on the ground of where this has happened. In fragile states, an approach like this could be destabilizing and could be catastrophic. It's for this reason that I am a much bigger fan, personally, of a building integrity approach. And I've really welcomed the three speakers that we've heard from today. The dynamics, everything about it, the language that you use, the images it brings up, the approaches and policies and so on, coming from an integrity approach are very different than an anti-corruption approach. The cost initiative is a good example of this. Martin Walsh, I'm sorry to say it's not the most sexy, it's not the most headline grabbing and so on, to be honest, but shabby construction really does grab headlines. So whether it's a school that collapses on its pupils, a bridge that never gets built, hospitals that collapse when there's an earthquake or so on, every time there's a major public project that's built by going way over budget and nobody understands why, and I'm certain we can look out the window and throw a stone and hit plenty of those here in the UK, those things grab headlines. So in post-war environments where there is an awful lot of money, as you pointed out, going into construction and reconstruction, there are high risks of things going badly. And when things go badly, they affect the way people feel in terms of their state, their society, and so on. So cost is about encouraging companies to operate in the best possible way, to get value for money for the taxpayer, to operate efficiently and effectively, to look at waste at every stage of operation, and to ultimately provide the public, whether the public that may be funding it through taxpayer money or the public that receiving the good, to get a good product. So it's not actually just about bribery and fraud, but it's about management capacity and effectiveness at every level. And this is about operating with integrity. To give you an example from my own research on local government in Afghanistan, DFIN is one of the handful of donors that are supporting local government finance in Afghanistan. And there's a particular fund that I find really exciting, which, if you can say that about local government finance, I'm not sure. But it's called a Performance-Based Governors Fund, and it's being piloted with a handful of provincial governors in Afghanistan. The thing that makes provincial governors interesting in Afghanistan is many, not all, but many of them are warlords or former warlords. They do not have a great reputation in terms of behaving with transparency and accountability. And one of the reasons why the Performance-Based Governors Fund came about was to try to stop the provincial governors from informally taxing the public, and actually to teach them about how to be administrators. So it provides core funding for the administration of their office, and they can spend it on a very well-articulated set of objectives and items and so on. It's managed by an international NGO, so there's one person from the Asia Foundation currently sitting in the office who agrees with dispersing things. There's a great deal of accountability built into the program, including engagement with community-based groups and regular reporting. But there's also an awful lot of discretion built into there. So there is one person responsible for dispersing the funds. It might not be the warlord, but it is somebody with whom collusion could easily come about. But this is actually intentional because it's much easier for the governors to go out and tax the public. So any sort of program has to actually be attractive to them for them to support it. So to make it as easy as possible while teaching people who've never administered in a particular way how to do so with accountability and transparency. It does entail some risks for corruption, but it also has some high rewards as well. If it's successful, then it will turn warlords into good governors. And for my money, that seems like a very good use of public funds. It's about building integrity. The thing that the three speakers have in common is an indirect approach to fighting corruption rather than a direct one. And one of the most exciting things I've read recently is Michael Johnston's background paper for the upcoming World Development Report that James mentioned when he first kicked us off. The paper's titled, First Do No Harm, Then Build Trust, Anti-Corruption Strategies in Fragile Situations. I suspect that the paper will be very influential, and it certainly deserves to be so. One of the key points made in the report, if I can quote directly, is that direct attacks on corruption may be the last thing a fragile situation needs in the early stages of transition. Such attacks may require credibility, material resources, expertise, and institutional strength that a regime and state do not possess. When society is divided, attacks on corruption may only be perceived as more factional or ethnic conflict. Instead, Michael proposes long-term indirect strategies that look to build essential trust within society and to build the state's capacity. Indirect strategies, such as the ones discussed today, and Martin Tisney also pointed to several others that could be brought to the table, fit very well with this approach. It is a departure on some level to the World Bank's approach over the past 15 years, and so it'll be interesting to see what the impact is of the World Development Report, not only on the bank but other donors and beyond. But indirect strategies may not make headlines. They may not end corruption overnight, but I'm not convinced that we actually always need big headlines, and I'm certainly not convinced that we can stop corruption anywhere overnight, let alone in some of the world's most difficult environments. So if building transparency and accountability in fragile states is a big challenge, it's certainly one that can only be tackled with humility and a sense of purpose. And by working in partnership with local communities, as Claire put it very well, identifying the priorities of post-war communities themselves and then working from there. It's also about strict adherence to do no harm precepts, as Michael Johnston reminds us. As the construction industry is a global industry, and one that is absolutely enormous, cost is one way we can actually put this precept into action. So we can actually look at changing the behavior of the way we go about doing business first and foremost. I disagree up to a certain point with Martin Tisney on the point that fragile states aren't unique. They are unique. They are extremely difficult. But I think that there's ultimately a lot of lessons to be learned here for the anti-corruption community as a whole. The underlying themes of being realistic, going for indirect strategies, and looking for long-term solutions, not just quick fixes, and for building integrity rather than fighting corruption actually really do apply. So even if the context may be different, the lessons to me apply beyond fragile states as well. So again, thank you very much to Alina for asking me to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Heather, thank